Watch the mercury rise as the pressure of the narrative builds toward an explosive and unforgettable conclusion. This is high-stakes drama at its finest, where every second counts and every word matters. Hit subscribe now and witness the breaking point of the truth as it unfolds.
I sat in that conference room and I did not look at my brother. Not once. He was 3 seats down, whispering something to his attorney, and I could feel him watching me the way he always had, like I was a problem he hadn't finished solving. I kept my hands flat on the table. I kept my breathing even. I had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who underestimate you is absolutely nothing. His attorney's name was Lawrence Briggs. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a coat 2 sizes too big. Loud, expensive, slightly ridiculous. He'd flown in from Atlanta. My brother had mentioned that twice already, like it was supposed to impress someone. He flew in from Atlanta, Cali. Atlanta, as if geography determined justice. My name is Callie Weston. I'm 31 years old, and until 14 months ago, most people in my family thought I worked at a nonprofit somewhere in Virginia, doing something vague with international development. My mother had told people that at church. My aunt had told people that at church. My aunt had told people that at Thanksgiving. My brother had told his attorney that under oath, in a formal mediation proceeding, right before he handed over a 40-page document accusing me of stealing $260,000 from our father's estate. He had no idea what he'd just done. Let me tell you about my father first, because none of this makes sense without him. His name was Harold Weston. He grew up in eastern Tennessee, the son of a mechanic and a school librarian, and he was the kind of man who fixed things. Not just cars and broken screen doors, but people. He had this quality I've never been able to name exactly. When you sat across from my father, you felt like the most important person in whatever room you were in. He listened like he meant it. He remembered everything. He remembered the names of your children, your allergies, the name of your childhood dog. He became a civil engineer. He built a small firm in Knoxville. Nothing flashy, mostly infrastructure contracts, bridges, water treatment, municipal roads. He was careful with money in the way that people who grew up without it tend to be. Not cheap. Careful, there's a difference. He drove the same truck for 11 years. He wore the same watch for 20. But he put my brother and me through college with no debt, kept my mother comfortable after her MS diagnosis, and never once made us feel like any of it was a burden. He died 18 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. 7 weeks. I was on a plane within 48 hours of the call. I won't tell you where I was flying from. That's part of what comes later. What I'll tell you is that I sat beside his bed in the hospice for 11 days straight. My brother, whose name is Kevin, visited 3 times. Each time he came, he spent at least 40 minutes alone with my father. I didn't think much of it then. They'd always been close in a way that felt transactional to me. Kevin understood my father's business, spoke his language, wanted to take over the firm someday. That was the plan. Kevin runs the firm, Callie does her nonprofit thing in Virginia. Everybody's fine. Except my father, in his final weeks, changed his will. And Kevin found out. The original will had divided everything evenly. The firm, the house, the investment accounts, split 50-50 between us. Standard. Clean, what you'd expect from a man who believed in fairness above almost everything. The revised will was different. My father left Kevin full operational control of the firm, which made sense. Kevin had been running day-to-day operations for 3 years. But he left the financial assets, the accounts, the house, the investment portfolio, in a trust managed by me. Not split with me. Managed by me on behalf of both of us, with distribution guidelines he'd written himself. He'd also included a letter, handwritten, 5 pages. I won't share what it said. That letter is mine. But I'll tell you that when I finished reading it, I sat in my rental car outside the attorney's office for 20 minutes before I could drive. Kevin didn't take it well. He called me the night after the reading. I remember the exact words. I don't know what you said to him, Callie. I don't know what you told him those last weeks. But I know you got in his ear, and I know what you are, and I will prove it. I told him I loved him, and I hung up. 6 weeks later, I received formal notice that he was contesting the will and filing a civil claim alleging undue influence, elder manipulation, and misappropriation of estate assets. $260,000, he claimed. gone from accounts he could trace, moved by me, to me, in the months before my father's death. Here is what Kevin believed about me. He believed I had left Knoxville at 22 because I couldn't handle real responsibility. He believed I'd drifted through some years of glorified volunteer work overseas, collecting experiences instead of a career. He believed the office in Virginia was a euphemism for barely employed, and that the real reason I'd never come home for more than a week at a time was shame. He believed I had watched our father get sick and seen an opportunity. He had built this story so completely in his own mind that by the time we sat across from each other in that conference room, he genuinely believed it. I could see it in his face. He wasn't performing outrage. He was certain. Lawrence Briggs started talking. "Ms. Weston," he said, and even the way he said my name had a particular texture to it, polite, patient, the tone you use with someone who doesn't quite understand how badly they've lost. "My client is prepared to be generous here. We're not asking for criminal referral at this stage. We simply want the estate restored. If you can provide documentation of your employment history, any documentation really, for the past 8 years, that would go a long way toward demonstrating that the withdrawals in question were legitimate and not a pattern of financial exploitation." He slid a folder across the table. I didn't open it. 8 years is a long time to have no verifiable income, he continued. No W-2s on file with the IRS under your social. No 1099s. Your last reported employer was a language school in Prague, which closed in 2019. Since then, nothing. No apartment lease in your name. No car registered to you, no credit activity beyond a single card with a $1,200 limit. You understand why that raises questions. Kevin was watching me now. Waiting. "I understand the question," I said. "Good. Then you'll understand why my client finds it difficult to believe that a woman with no verifiable income managed to, as you claim, loan her father's estate $40,000 to cover a property tax shortfall in 2023. I don't claim it. I did it. With money from where exactly?" I looked at him. Then I looked at Kevin. "With money I earned," I said. Briggs smiled. It was a small, careful smile, the kind that means we both know that's not true. "Ms. Weston, I've had 2 forensic accountants go through your financial profile going back a decade. There is no income. There are no assets in your name. There is no employer. You appear to exist, financially speaking, almost entirely off the grid. Now, I'm sure there's an explanation for that, but from where my client sits, the most straightforward explanation is that the money you loaned the estate came from the estate, which would make it not a loan, which would make it theft." The room was quiet. My attorney, whose name is Faye, she'd driven up from Nashville, and she was worth every mile, put her hand on the table in front of me, not touching me. Just present. I'd told her everything before we walked in. She knew what was in the folder I'd brought. She knew what was about to happen. I reached into my bag and placed a manila envelope on the table. "I'd like to request," I said, "that we pause this proceeding for the mediator to review a document." The mediator's name was Judge Catherine Aldrich, retired, Federal Bench, Eastern District of Tennessee, 22 years. She'd been appointed by the mediation service, which was standard. Neither side had chosen her specifically. She was 70 years old, silver-haired, and had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 2 decades listening to people lie to her professionally and had become very good at knowing when it was happening. She looked at me when I said, "Document." Just a flicker of attention. I handed the envelope to Faye, who walked it to Judge Aldrich. Judge Aldrich opened it. She read for approximately 45 seconds. Then she set the document down, removed her reading glasses, and looked at me directly. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. The way you look at someone when you realize you've been misreading the room. "Ms. Weston," she said, and her voice had changed. "Would you mind if we took a short recess?" Briggs frowned. "Your Honor, Judge Aldrich, if there is a document being introduced, my client has the right to—" "Mr. Briggs," she said it quietly. "Recess. Here is what was in that envelope. I won't give you specifics because I genuinely cannot. What I can tell you is that it was a letter on official letterhead from a federal agency, an agency whose name you would recognize, confirming my employment status, the general nature of my work, and the reason my financial records appear the way they do. It also included a secondary document, which Faye had obtained through a formal declassification request 6 weeks prior. authorizing limited disclosure of my employment history for the purposes of this legal proceeding. The reason there are no W-2s is that I don't file W-2s. The reason there is no apartment lease is that I have not, for the past 7 years, lived anywhere long enough to sign one. The reason there is no credit history is that the credit history that exists for me belongs to a name I don't use in rooms like this one. I have been employed continuously, full-time, at a salary I am not permitted to disclose since I was 23 years old. I was recruited out of my graduate program. I went through a process I cannot describe. And then I went to work. My father knew. He had known for 4 years. I had told him when his diagnosis came because I decided that if I only had weeks with him, I wanted him to know who I actually was. We had talked for hours. He had cried, and I had cried, and he had held my face in his hands and said, "I always knew you were something, Callie. I just didn't know what." The letter in that envelope explained enough. It didn't explain everything. It couldn't. But it explained the money. It explained why the trust had been set up the way it had, with me as manager rather than Kevin, because my father had understood something that Kevin hadn't bothered to learn. I was not the family drifter. I had been, for the better part of a decade, doing work that required the kind of judgment and discretion that you don't develop at a desk. He had revised his will because he trusted me, not because I had manipulated him. Because he had finally fully understood what I was capable of. Judge Aldrich came back into the conference room 12 minutes later. She sat down. She folded her hands. Kevin was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just felt the ground shift and wasn't sure yet in which direction. Briggs was very still. He'd been on his phone during the recess. He'd looked up something. I could tell from the way he wasn't making eye contact with anyone. "Mr. Weston," Judge Aldrich said, looking at Kevin, "I've reviewed the documentation provided by your sister. I am not in a position to share its full contents with you today, for reasons that I think will become clear to you in the coming days. What I can tell you is that the claim of financial misappropriation, as presented in your filing, is not supported by the evidence available to this proceeding." Kevin opened his mouth. "Furthermore," she continued, "I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve directness. The withdrawals you identified were not theft. The financial activity you characterized as predatory was, in fact, your sister using her own funds to support your father's estate during a period of shortfall. She has receipts. She has documentation. She has 7 years of financial records that cannot be presented in this room but that have been reviewed by the appropriate authority and found entirely legitimate." The silence was complete. I watched my brother's face. I have thought about that moment many times since. What I felt was not triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to grief, actually. The specific grief of being truly seen by someone for the first time and realizing how long you'd been invisible. I had spent 8 years being the sister who ran away, the daughter who didn't call enough, the woman at the Thanksgiving table who deflected every question about her job with a smile and a subject change. I had done that because I had to, because that was the agreement I had made and the work I had chosen, and I did not regret it. But there is a cost to invisibility. There is a cost to being known by no one. And sitting in that room, watching my brother realize he had built a 40-page legal document on a foundation of assumptions, I felt that cost very clearly. He hadn't sued me because he was greedy, exactly. He'd sued me because he genuinely believed the story he'd told himself. That I was nothing, that I had always been nothing. That the only way a woman with no apparent job and no apparent life could have any influence over our father's final decisions was through manipulation. He had never considered the alternative. That maybe I wasn't nothing. That maybe he just hadn't been paying attention. Briggs asked for a 90-day continuance to review the new documentation. Judge Aldrich denied it. She said that given the nature of the materials provided and the confirmation from the relevant authority, she saw no basis for continuing the mediation and recommended immediate dismissal of the civil claim. She also noted, in the careful language of someone who has spent decades in courtrooms, that the filing had included certain characterizations of my character and employment history that were demonstrably false, and that Kevin and his counsel might want to consider going forward. The legal implications of making false statements in formal filings. Briggs went pale. Kevin said, quietly, "I didn't know." I looked at him for a long time. "I know you didn't," I said. That was true. He hadn't known. He had simply never tried to find out. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that. Not the cruelty of malice, but the cruelty of indifference, of looking at your own sister and deciding, without evidence, without curiosity, without love, that she was small. He had decided I was small because it was convenient, because it made him the capable one, the responsible one, the son who stayed. Because my absence had always been a mystery to him, and mystery made him uncomfortable, and the easiest way to resolve discomfort is to fill the unknown with something diminishing. I stood up. Faye gathered her files. I picked up my bag. I did not storm out. I did not make a speech. There was no version of this ending where I said everything I'd ever wanted to say, because the truth is, I didn't have a speech ready. I hadn't spent years rehearsing a confrontation. I had just done my job, lived my life, and trusted that the truth, when it finally needed to come forward, would know how to walk into a room. At the door, I stopped. Not for drama. I stopped because Kevin said my name. Callie. I turned around. He looked older than he had an hour ago. Smaller. Not in a satisfying way, just in the way that people look when something they believed has turned out not to be true and they haven't figured out yet what replaces it. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he said. "You could have just told me." I thought about that for a moment. "I couldn't," I said. "Not then. Not the way things were. But Dad knew." Yes, he knew, and he didn't tell me either. He knew it wasn't his to tell. Kevin looked down at the table, at the 40-page document he'd spent months building, at the version of me he'd constructed carefully and completely from nothing. "I'm sorry," he said. I heard it. I believed he meant it. Apologies at the moment of exposure are complicated things. They're real, but they're also inevitably tangled up with the shock of having been wrong, and it takes time, usually, to figure out how much of the sorrow is for what you did and how much is just for having been caught in it. I would give him time. He was my brother. Despite everything, he was my brother. "I know," I said, and I walked out. The drive back to the hotel took 11 minutes. I know because I counted traffic lights. I sat in the parking garage for a while, with the engine off, not crying, exactly, just existing in that particular stillness that comes after high-stakes things resolve. I had a phone call to make, a brief report to file, a few encrypted messages to respond to. Work didn't stop for family court, it never had. But before I did any of that, I took something out of my jacket pocket. It was a photograph. Small, slightly bent at one corner, the way photographs get when they've been carried too long. My father and me, outside his office building in Knoxville. Maybe 8 years ago, he was pointing at something off camera. I was laughing at whatever it was. We were both squinting against the sun. He had not known then what I did for a living. He had only known I was happy. I think about the last conversation we had in the hospice, the real one, not the gentle small talk we did in front of nurses. He had taken my hand and he'd said, "You always thought I didn't see you, Callie. But I saw you. I just didn't have the words for what I was seeing." I had told him he didn't need the words. He had disagreed. He said the words mattered. He said he was sorry it took this long to find them. I put the photograph away. I made my calls. And then I drove back toward the highway, toward the work waiting for me, toward the life I'd built in the in-between spaces where no one thinks to look. And I thought about my father, and the trust he'd placed in my hands, and how, of all the things I had ever been asked to protect in my career, that one I would never, not once, fail. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to be known by someone, not recognized, not praised. Known. There's a difference, and I didn't fully understand it until I sat in that conference room watching my brother's certainty collapse in real time. Kevin had spent years building a version of me that made sense to him, the sister who ran, the daughter who disappeared, the woman with no job, no lease, no paper trail, just a vague story about Virginia and a smile that deflected every question. He had taken my absence and my silence and my inability to explain myself, and he had filled all of that space with something small, something convenient. And then, when our father died and money was involved, he had taken that small thing and built a legal case around it. What I've come to understand is that he wasn't wrong to need an explanation. He was wrong about what the explanation was. That's the thing about filling in what you don't know with what you fear. You're almost never right, but you're almost always convinced. Kevin wasn't lying in that conference room. He believed every word, and that, honestly, is harder to sit with than malice. Malice you can dismiss. Genuine certainty built on a false foundation, That one stays with you. My father understood something that took me longer to learn. He understood that living with integrity doesn't always look like integrity from the outside. For years, the work I was doing, real work, hard work, the kind that requires everything you have and gives very little back in the way of visibility, looked, from a distance, like nothing. No apartment, no tax returns, no LinkedIn profile, just absence, just silence. And I had accepted that as the cost of the choices I made because I believed the choices were worth it. What I hadn't fully reckoned with was the cost to the people who loved me and couldn't understand. I don't think I owe anyone an explanation for my life. I still believe that. But I've learned slowly, with some damage along the way, that there is a difference between privacy and disappearance. I had vanished so completely from my family's understanding of me that the gap I left was big enough for my own brother to fill with a courtroom accusation. That's not entirely on him. The mediator, Judge Aldrich, never said much to me directly. But on the way out of the building, she paused beside me in the hallway and said something I've thought about since. She said, "The people who do the quiet work are always the hardest to defend. Make sure the right people know." I think about that. About my father, who knew. About the 5-page letter he wrote me in that hospice room. About the trust he placed in my hands, not as a reward, but as a statement. I see you. I know what you are. He had done something profound with his final weeks of clarity. He had refused to let me stay invisible. He had looked directly at the daughter everyone else had written off and written down, in legal language, in his own handwriting, what he actually believed about her. That kind of witness, being truly seen by someone who chooses to see you, changes something in a person. It changes what you're willing to fight for. It changes how long you're willing to be patient. It changes what you understand about the relationship between doing the right thing and being recognized for it. Those two things are not the same. They don't always happen together. And learning to act with integrity even when no recognition is coming, even when the absence of recognition gets mistaken for guilt, that is the work that actually builds a person. Kevin said he was sorry. I believe he meant it. I'm still figuring out what comes next for us. Some distances take longer to close than they took to open. But I walked out of that building carrying something I hadn't walked in with. Not vindication, exactly. More like clarity. The clarity of a story finally told in full. To the people who needed to hear it. My father left me that trust because he knew I'd protect it. He was right.